Welcome to another show of KXCR Radio's Fireside Chat. I want to welcome you this evening. We are a nonprofit educational radio station. And tonight we are going to be speaking with Senator Arnie Roblin, giving us an update from the legislature this week with Senator Lou Frederick. And tonight we've got some great policy minds from the state of Oregon on race relations and conflict resolution. We're going to feature Professor Eric Gervin from the University of Oregon. And then we're also going to have Laurel Singer. She's the executive director of the National Policy of Consensus Center in Portland State University. And also we've got one of her program managers, Manuel Padilla. Welcome. And we've also got one of their consultants with the Novogenic Consulting and Damien Isaiah Turner. So Arnie, thank you so much for joining us, and take it away.
I just want to say thank you again to all of those people out there who are watching and listening. It's always fun when I think of it as a radio show, but we're also going live through Facebook Live, and we appreciate all of those that share this feed around the state. This last week was one of those hectic weeks. We had a very, very short session, special session. The governor called it for yesterday, Monday, and we started at 8 o'clock yesterday morning and finished at the Senate about 10 o'clock. I think the House got done about an hour later. And we had been spending probably 2 months getting ready for it. This was the special session that was billed to take care of the budget. And I see Lou is on now, so that's great. Thanks to see you, Lou. So all of our budget committees have been working over the past month to try to figure out how could we take a $2.5 billion shortfall because of this pandemic and economic fall that has happened to our country. How could we balance the budget so that, as most people know, our states are required by the Constitution to have a balanced budget, so we cannot overspend. So we had to look at what are the things that we are going to do to balance that budget. Our budget committees got together and worked and talked to agencies and tried to figure out what's the way to do that, which would, one, keep education whole, two, keep housing spending up, because we want to make sure that people are in houses and food, and then work around the edges to try to make sure that we cut things that if we had vacancies, we didn't replace them. If we had other places where we could save money, which wouldn't affect the agencies doing the work they needed to do, whether that be in veterans or the transportation sector. How do we make those budget cuts? We gave those recommendations to our Ways and Means strike chairs, and they came up with a budget along with the Senate President and the Speaker of the House, and we put those into 7 budget bills that we had to work on. And then there were 3 bills on unemployment insurance, UI, trying to figure out, they came from the department saying these things would help us get our work done. And then 2 of the bills that our special committee on policing were working on. They combined those 2 into 1 bill. So those were kind of what we were going to work on. And we came to the session. We had 2 special committees that were going. One worked on that special committee. One worked on all of the budget bills along with the UI bills. The other one worked specifically on the issues with respect to safety and policing. And Lou was involved in in those from the very beginning. Actually, Lou has been involved with this conversation for most of his life, and that's one of the reasons it's kind of nice to have him here with us. So we actually passed all but one of the bills that we originally had set. One UI bill did not get passed. It had to do with employees in the public sector, schools, who are not teachers, were not counselors. They are the classified staff who don't work for 3 months of the year. They don't qualify for UI as it is regularly done. In this particular time, we thought it would have been a good idea to have that happen. That bill did not pass. So we also are anticipating that we're going to have another go around with our e-board later this week to finish some stuff that we didn't get done last week. And I guess what I would say now is the budget stuff worked, I think, reasonably well. We also put $200 million into the e-board, so we have some money to take care of fire season. We have some money to work on healthcare as we need. But I thought I'd give Lou a chance and to say a few words if he wants to about the special session in general, and a couple of the issues that have actually framed a lot of the work he's done over the last number of years that I've known him in the legislature, trying to get some stuff done and to continue the momentum that has happened over the last few months. So, Lou, you want to say a few words about the session?
Just a few. I thank you very much, Arnie. Thanks for inviting me once again. The fact is we are taking steps. This is not, none of these bills end up getting everything done that we need to get done. They don't even get close necessarily to all the things we need to get done, but we need to have some steps. And one of the first bills that I introduced in the legislature when Arnie was the Speaker of the House was a bill that talked about redefining use of force and just what that meant. It was something that we talked about. This is 2011. So I was talking about that then. We actually have we now have, in fact, a redefinition of use of force that looks at the reasonable force that a regular person would look at, not just reasonable force in terms of what a police officer might think. And so we have that as a change that's taken place. And again, it sort of gives you a sense of where we want to go. We really want to rethink how we deal with police and law enforcement and public safeties in the state. And that's what a lot of these bills are really pushing for, is to what does public safety look like, not only in terms of law enforcement officers or officers, but also what it means to the general public. Will you feel safe in a situation when you call a police officer to come and help you? That's a safety issue as well. So a lot of this is going on with a change in philosophy and attitude. You will see bills coming up that deal with recruitment, with training, with discipline, with tracking police officers, as well as some basic concepts that we're looking at related to militarization of the police. We have an entirely too much of a military feel to people dealing with supposedly their neighbors and friends, but instead they are dressed as though they're ready to go into Afghanistan somewhere. And we've got to change that approach as well. And really, frankly, understand what it is we want with public safety. And that means, what are we really dealing with? Most police officers never pull their gun. Most police officers find themselves dealing with social issues and addiction issues and other things rather than any sort of violent situation. So we need to make sure that we're really using our resources in a way that are appropriate. So you're going to see a lot more discussion about that. And that's what I'm pleased with. I saw the state legislature take on those issues and begin the process. And I'm just very pleased with that. It's not going to be enough. It's not going to be everything that we need, but it's certainly different than what we've seen.
Yeah, I appreciated your work. And James Manning did a really nice job of doing the explanation and bringing a lot of voices together. You know, people think that everybody's here trying to say things negatively about the police, and that was not the purpose of this whole meeting. And just what you said, he brought all those people together, the sheriff's department, the police officers. He had real conversations. He himself was a police officer in the Eugene. So, I mean, I think what we're really talking about is looking at this whole issue of public safety and coming up with a better plan so that really people all feel safe in the public, and we can resolve problems and get them done. And that's what tonight's show is about, actually. We're here to start talking with some of our the best minds that we have in Oregon at our universities who have devoted their lives to looking at how do we deal with bias? How do we deal with racism? Oftentimes people will say, I will talk to someone and they'll say, well, I'm not a racist. I've never had a racist thought in my life. And then you start having a conversation with them and you realize, there's some bias underneath there that they don't even know they have. And I tell people all the time, you know, for me as a kid, and I tell people I was this dyslexic ADHD human being. And so teachers would think because I didn't do well in school early on, that I was lazy. And I had nothing. I worked harder than any of my friends did, but there was this bias that if you couldn't do the work, obviously you didn't work hard enough at it. And I think we all have those kind of biases. And so we're going to invite into this conversation right now Eric Gervin, who is the University of Oregon professor who's really went and spent his life trying to figure out, and now works in, I think, the law school as well, but he has a couple of degrees. But he has been looking at bias from the perspective of schools, all of these different kinds of things. And I just wanted to have him explain a little bit about what is this unconscious or implicit bias that you've looked at for much of your career.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Roland. Thank you for having me on the show, and thanks for everyone who's out there watching. Yeah, so when I think about bias, or when I study bias or work with organizations on how to reduce discrimination, we experience one of the lenses that we use, or one of the concepts that we use, is this unconscious or implicit bias that you mentioned. And I think probably the easiest way to understand unconscious bias is quick assumptions that we make about people based on characteristics that we can see easily about them or are easily accessible. And so one that you mentioned, which I think is a great example, is if a teacher looks at someone and seeing that they're performing well, they might make an assumption that that has to do with their motivation, right? As you said, somebody make an assumption that they're lazy. And there are a lot of other bases that people can make assumptions based on how someone's dressed, right, when you're walking down the street, or their race or their sex, or any of those other characteristics that we can see easily. And one of the things that our brains do is learn over time to try to make those kinds of associations just in order to be efficient. We do it not just with people, with everything, but that's the basic idea. It works the same way. That a lot of the time what we do is we walk around, we see things, we understand quickly, or try to make quick judgments or assessments about what they're like based on features. And we don't really know because we haven't taken the time to explore them, to talk with them, to understand more about them. And so that's what you can think about, those kind of unconscious or implicit biases, is those sort of automatic assumptions. And one thing that, psychologists, so part of my trainings in psychology, differentiate between those kinds of unconscious or subtle biases and more overt ones, sort of more overt forms of racism. And the main distinction between them is essentially what happens when you talk to people, or when somebody thinks about it, right? If your teacher says, well, I think he's lazy, and then they get a chance to know you, and they learn and they change and they say, no, he's a hard worker, there might be a different cause about it, or those other pieces, then those are their beliefs, and they're kind of updating or they're changing. If somebody says, I don't think that people from a particular group are as hardworking as people from another kind of group, and if they meet a hard worker, they say, well, that person's an exception, but those people still aren't as hard workers, right? That they actively believe it, or they endorse it, or they defend it as a truth. That's kind of that overt kind of maybe racism or sexism or forms of bias. Those underlying assumptions aren't necessarily that at all. They're just things that we carry around in order to try to understand the world. The problem is a lot of them are inaccurate in any way. They end up affecting the way we make judgments, so that it hurts people, and not everybody gets a fair shake.
So along that line, how does that those jump decisions that we make, how does that manifest itself in actions and the things that we do, whether it's in education or business, or in the judiciary system as we go through courts? How does this kind of jumping to conclusions based on our beliefs internally, how does that manifest it in our day-to-day lives in those different organizations? Any ideas or examples you can share with people?
Yeah, I do a lot of research and also work with a lot of organizations in the areas that you've talked about. So schools, one of my colleagues at the College of Education of the University of Oregon, and others around the country do a lot of work with schools. And one thing we know from a lot of research on schools and data that's schools are required to report nationally, is that Black students, for example, end up being suspended and expelled at much, much higher rates than white students. And so one of the questions that we have is why, right? Why is that in there? And we could look. And one of the things that we know from doing that research is that a lot of the difference comes down to pretty subjective assessments. So it's not that Black students are getting into fights or vandalizing the building or other things like that that are really easy to detect. I mean, if somebody punches somebody else in the face, they're going to go to the office and probably get suspended, right? There's not much wiggle room in your understanding of that situation. But what happens is Black students tend to get suspended more for things that are kind of subjective, like defiance or disrespect, right? How somebody makes a teacher is trying to teach something and they give an assignment and you get kind of some back talk. And the question for a teacher's mind is sort of, how can I handle it in the classroom? Or is it severe enough that I have to send somebody to the principal's office? And where that line is probably depends on things like whether the teacher is feeling patient at that time, whether they've had a good lunch versus whether they're hungry, whether, right, these sort of conditions can affect it. If you're, all of us, right, we know when we're tired, when we're hungry, when we're annoyed, when we're whatever it is, we might make these snap judgments that you talked about. So one thing we know, that areas where we have those kinds of snap judgments are areas where those assumptions, those automatic assumptions, tend to influence our judgments more. And so that's a certain educational example, is that the vast majority of the difference between the discipline rates is related to those kind of subjective decisions from teachers, not to what we think of as overt kind of really bad behaviors. And so we're talking about those assumptions. There's a study that was kind of a nice example study that was done out of Yale a few years ago. And they showed some teachers a video and asked the teachers, basically they told them the following, said, we know that really good teachers are able to tell when a student's kind of about to misbehave. So what we want you to do is watch this video and identify when the students are about to misbehave, because I know that's when you would start to do a correction or some other kind of thing to get them back on track. Well, it turned out that the video actually didn't have any misbehavior in it, but what it did have is it had pictures of students that were working, young children actually, who were working, and the children were Black or white and male or female. And so what they were looking at, or what they're actually testing, is where do these teachers expect the misbehavior to come from? Where do they look? And what they found is the teachers spend most of their time looking at the Black kids and not the white kids, and particularly the Black male kid. And so if you have that kind of assumption, the expectation that's going into a situation, we could imagine that all the students are misbehaving at the same amount. But if you're only paying attention to a small set of them, then those are the ones you catch. Right, and those are the ones that get written up. And so we have that kind of situation. So that's maybe a school example. Very similar research in law enforcement. We were talking about that earlier. The State Criminal Justice Commission came out with a study a couple years ago that showed that Black Oregonians have about 3.5 times the likelihood of being incarcerated for illegal drug use, even though the rates of drug use for Black and white Oregonians is essentially identical. And so where does that kind of difference come from? And there's a lot of research and a lot of explanations, but part of it is back to this idea of where do people worry about drug use? Where do people allocate resources? Where do people pay attention to? And those assumptions about where that occurs. And so those are a couple of real examples, and I have some others, and it's sort of in the workplace too. Examples of studies showing that you get in a workplace where somebody wants some accounting done, and maybe they assume that the younger employees, their new employees there, who are men, are better at math, and so they select them or tend to give the projects to their male instead of to their females. New workers. Well, if that stuff happens and people make those assumptions, they may very well be completely wrong. In fact, people coming in may have the same qualifications or whatever. But if you make those kinds of assumptions and then you wait 5 years, now the males have a lot more experience with accounting problems, more relationships with accounting clients, et cetera, and those kinds of things. And that affects their career trajectory just because of those sort of subtle assumptions that somebody made about whether the men or women might have been better at math sort of over time, instead of bothering to actually check it out and try it out.
So you bring up the math example is always good for me, because as I told people, math was the thing that came to me earliest. And so people thought I was smarter than I probably am because I could do math problems. And I will tell you, if there was a movie that shocked me the most, it was the recognition of Hidden Figures, the issue of the Apollo flights and these African American women who actually were the brains behind getting them there and back. And I go back and I think, why wasn't that known at the time? Why wasn't that story being told? And it seems like it's a lot like what you're talking about with this hidden biases. It wasn't a story that people were ready to accept, so we didn't hear about it. And any explanations about why that kind of stuff happened? I go back because I really loved math and I like to do history. I found out that the Greeks and the Romans, who we always think of as the big math people, they never even figured out how to use zero.
Right.
It took Arabs to show us how to do that. And if you want to talk about a whole bunch of the other stuff, you can go to India and find out some stuff, or China. So there's a lot of amazing mathematicians from every race in this planet, and yet we have a kind of a bias in our teaching that it all comes from Greece. So I guess what I'm saying is, can you give us any examples of what's going on there and how we can change some of that stuff? I'm pleased that we finally found some movies that showed the other side of some of that story. And I'm going to let, after you have a conversation with that, I want Lou to ask any questions he has, because I know there have been at least once in his life where there were biases that influenced his life as well. So,
Yeah, I'm sure all of us can. So Hidden Figures is a great example, and at many levels. For those of you who haven't seen it, I really encourage it. One way, I mean, the title itself, The Hidden Figures, is that these people were, these women who were Black women, were hidden, I think precisely in that case, as an example of very overt systematic racism, right? This idea, I mean, at the time we have the segregated military, we have, right, so all these characteristics, the, Alan Turing, the man who essentially invented computers and broke the Nazi codes so that we could succeed largely in World War II, happened to be homosexual. And for that reason, right, was essentially isolated and ultimately, ended up committing suicide from part of that. And so some of those were very overt prejudices, right? And these people were hidden because they thought maybe society isn't ready for this knowledge or recognition, or it goes so against the underlying assumptions about how people are. And over, not just the assumptions, but at that time, a lot of overt beliefs about it. I think one other thing that makes it a great example is that's part of the way those sort of institutional types of racism, where certain people are given certain roles or allocated or segregated to particular locations, whether it's schools or neighborhoods or other pieces like that, those are what feed into the assumptions. So we take Brown versus Board of Education, right? This landmark Supreme Court case designed to desegregate schools. And you can think through what that actually looked like, because in many cases, what happened is, okay, so that was even when you could get cities to enforce it. What you have is you have African-American students from schools that were severely underfunded, maybe no textbooks, really large class sizes, right? These kinds of things. Now going to schools with white kids that had a lot of funding, up-to-date textbooks, small class sizes, a lot of other pieces. And so what happens now is you're sitting in a classroom with students from two racial groups. One of them essentially has had no education for the last 3 years, and the others have had an education. And there's a danger that the students attribute the difference to race when it's really structural and institutional racism that caused it, right? And so this is an example, right, of that. And then people take that and then they make assumptions about the abilities of people because that's who they know when what happened is one of them was segregated, isolated, stuck in a place. So the overt biases that cause the women and Hidden Figures to be isolated also prevented people from knowing about them so that they could challenge their explicit biases and who's there. So, for the same reason, one of the ways that we develop these kinds of associations is those prominent figures. We think about the space program and we think about like Neil Armstrong. But it actually turns out that the US astronaut that has spent the longest time in space is a woman. Right? And so having these prominent examples helps people challenge, like, okay, so our astronaut actually with the most experience is not somebody that looks like Neil Armstrong. It's a woman with a PhD in biochemistry. who challenges those assumptions and those other pieces. But if we hide them, then people can't learn, as you point out, sort of the truth. I mean, you read sort of these somewhat, they're gotcha studies, but around this, if you go around the country and you tell people like, should our schools be teaching the Arabic number system? And you get people saying, no, they can't learn that because they don't know what it is. They just go on this idea of these sort of stereotypes. And so it takes that kind of pushing out, the unhiding, right? And also the recognition that the hiding of it itself causes a lot of these to be perpetuated.
So Lou, I wanted to give you a chance to ask a few questions of Dr. Gervin.
There are actually a couple of things. First of all, I have to chuckle because there are a whole series of things we could talk about within this. I desegregated my high school, and my first math teacher, when I was easily able to do the homework as she was putting it on the board, I suggested that I might want to go into algebra instead, and she would allow it, but she told me, but you know, your people aren't good at math. and she thought she was being nice about it, and I said I didn't say this because I was 4'10" at that particular point and did not want to create a problem for her or for me, but I wanted to say, hey, listen, who do you think invented this stuff? But the fact is these are those kinds of implicit biases were constant. One of them you should also recognize is, and I encourage you to take a look at a book called Our Kind of People. If you don't have it in your list, it's something you might look at because it also breaks part of the stereotype that you might have of some of the schools that we had in the Black community in particular, and continue to have. There were a lot of schools that were very poorly funded, had no books. My grandfather taught sharecropper kids in Mississippi and Missouri using books that had been thrown away by the white schools. So I know all of that, but there were also schools at times that were also doing other things. That's why I was able to do algebra, because I was talking and working in classes where the teachers had very clear, high expectations, and we lived up to it. But the other thing I wanted to mention, you mentioned something very quickly about a bias in terms of police officers and drugs. We actually did an experiment unintentionally regarding that when we looked at profiling in the state of Oregon, and the bill that we passed in 2017 also included a situation where the possession of a controlled substance went from being a felony to a misdemeanor. And the numbers of people who were charged with possession of a controlled substance dropped dramatically. I think in Multnomah County, it was almost 90%. So I asked, and especially among African Americans. So it went from 300 per 10,000 African Americans to 50 per 10,000. When I talked with police officers about why that was the case, their answer to me was, well, the fact is it's not worth it to pull in, to go and arrest or harass Black folks who are driving along, because now they only get misdemeanor convictions, and we have an internal competition that takes place in the locker room about how many felons you bring in. So you're not able to bring in these folks who are not felons, so we don't want to. We don't even bother people, which dropped the number of folks who had felony convictions a great deal, which meant an awful lot of folks would be actually able to get housing and jobs and business loans and all of those things that are attached to that bias that you're talking about.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for those examples too. And I know one that it makes me think of that I think that your school one is important is that, of course, the African American community being segregated did a lot of work itself to try to develop schools, the historic Black college university system, right? And one that that has come out recently, particularly with discussions of, depending on who's framing it, protests or particular riots and destruction in Minneapolis, the story of Black Wall Street in Tulsa. And the idea that it was African-American community, a lot of whom were veterans who served the United States in World War I, who built a really strong economic powerhouse. in a segregated area, right? This is not about some ability associated thing with race. The African-American people were able to do that too. And then it was destroyed by the white people who lived around them, right? And including firebombing them, yeah.
Yeah, but you know, you don't have to do it in terms of firebombing. You can also do it like we did it in Portland, which was close down whole communities, set up a system so that you're moving a whole neighborhood out of the convention center, out of the Coliseum area, and wiping out the Black Wall Street, basically, that was in Portland, that was right across, that was at between Williams Avenue and Vancouver Avenue on Russell there. That was a full block, or several blocks actually, of that kind of a vibrant Black business community that was moved back in 1960 something. I can't remember what it was, 62 or something. And the block that's there has not been replaced. They have not done it. It has been empty since they tore down this thing. So it was not just a violent situation. It can also be an economic violence, and that's what we've seen in Oregon.
And definitely, I think the last one is that story is replicated all across the country with public works projects and the development of the interstate highway system at that time, is that essentially mowing down emerging, prosperous, culturally viable communities from immigrants, minorities, et cetera, and separating them in order to put in the highway system, the effect of which was to destroy those communities and set the people who had started their lives there back by decades at a minimum.
But I think we've started to help raise the issue and really start that conversation. We need to continue it. We also need to think about what are the mechanisms to help us recognize it. I think part of it is the conversations that we're having. But there's another group of my intellectual friends from Portland State that have really been working on how do we collaborate, how do we resolve conflicts, conflict resolution, and so on. So we have in the second half of this evening's conversation, and I'll turn it back to David Dolly to ask a couple of questions, and then we'll get going. And I know that Lou and I will be involved in this conversation as well. So David, you want to start this part of the conversation?
Yeah, and thank you, Professor Gervin, for that update on where we are societally on the progresses that we made. But we're going to transition to the discussion of alternative dispute resolution. We have Laurel with us. And Laurel, for our audiences and for the Policy Center you work for, share with us how that is so key right now.
Well, ADR, just to kind of set the tone, is a shorthand for alternative dispute resolution. And it's used to describe a range of conflict resolution approaches that are more inclusive, more representative. Rather than creating a winner and a loser, you have people who are impacted by a problem coming together to look for solutions. And now more than ever, I think, as we are really keenly aware of the need to really transform our institutions and our policies, these kind of approaches are more and more being looked at. Some of those approaches include mediation, arbitration, other forms of negotiation. And I should also say that some people think of ADR as standing for appropriate dispute resolution, to reinforce the idea that courts, along with these alternative forms, all have their merits. The key is just finding the right approach for each situation. Now, Oregon is a leader in supporting the use of mediation and collaboration for addressing a range of personal conflicts, as well as public policy issues. And it has an infrastructure to make those services available to Oregonians. The infrastructure has two prongs, and one is a program that operates at the community level for addressing personal issues, and the other is one at the policy level, and that's my center. But I do want to highlight the community level. That's coordinated by the Oregon Office for Community Dispute Resolution. It's housed at the University of Oregon. That program actually consists of a network of 15 community-based centers around the state that offer help in addressing personal issues, neighbor to neighbor, landlord-tenant disputes, foreclosure mediation, eviction intervention, resolving tensions around parent and teenagers, as well as restorative justice with juvenile offenders. Most of those centers operate with some staff, but primarily volunteers, where communities are helping each other in resolving some of those disputes. And then there's our program at the Center for the National Policy Consensus Center at Portland State. And that program is called Oregon Consensus. And this is really an alternative to typical kinds of policymaking, and alternatives to either the courts or legislative fixes, where it works by bringing together the range of interests who are impacted by an issue to work together to find solutions to these challenging and controversial issues that are facing Oregonians. What we find is when people are working together on these outcomes, the solutions are more lasting and durable, and they often break up the logjam of constant litigation. So some of these approaches are used in a very particular area where you might have a conflict around some policy related to a particular area, or it might be statewide, like rehauling our recycling system. Or it could be, right now we're engaged Senator Roblin's backyard around helping resolve some issues around the Elliott State Forest. So these highly contentious issues where you can bring the people who are involved and impacted to the table to try to work through some more lasting and satisfying solutions.
So how have you seen how does it impact the current climate in the midst of our BLM movement, the pandemic, and the economic downturn? And why is it relevant now in the context of relationship to race and public policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to introduce Manuel, who's one of the staff people at the center. And you want to speak to that, Manuel?
Yeah, thank you, Laurel. So, I think the relevancy partly comes when we're looking at the, unique sort of confluence of events that we're experiencing right now. COVID is definitely the context, and people are stuck at home and stressed and hurting. We've had these horrific events that the majority of people have found out about at sort of roughly the same time, involving Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and the incident between Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper. We have the impact, the economic impact of the pandemic, and then we have the understanding of the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on BIPOC people. So, I think this has kind of commanded the attention of a vast sort of cross-section of the American public. So, the confluence of these events have kind of brought into focus those disparities suffered by BIPOC people in particular, not just in terms of police brutality, but in outcomes in health, education, and other economic opportunities that have been highlighted by the pandemic. And, not for the first time, I think we understand the urgent need in this context to transform public policies and correct the disparities. So collaborative approaches in that context can be really relevant as mechanisms for forging new policies, particularly in trying to assure that BIPOC communities are represented and centered at the proverbial table. So, although no one tool can make the changes that are needed, I think it's important to recognize the strengths and limitations of each tool. So, some of the principal strengths, I would say some of the principles and strengths of collaborative approaches and ADR, are sort of principles first. The mediation or facilitative approaches are a lot more informal than court-based systems and other governmental procedures. So informality, I think, is one guiding principle. The court-based processes typically produce a winner and a loser, where things like mediation are facilitated by someone in order to sort of explore the conflict, the needs around the conflict, and the interests of the parties, so that they can work together to find solutions that are mutually beneficial. Other principles are that the ADR approaches are deliberative. it's not just two people sort of presenting their sides and making their cases, but rather they're sharing and discussing different perspectives that help build better understanding and kind of lay a foundation on which mutually beneficial solutions can be based. Other things are distinction. One of the distinctions is that the court, the outcome is decided by a third party or a judge, but in mediation, participants share decision making, and those people who are involved in the conflict can create solutions that work for them without a third party imposing something that maybe doesn't work for either of them. And facilitated approaches can provide an opportunity for deeper exploration of a problem, which can certainly help build better understanding between people involved and possibly allow a repair of relationships or a rebuilding of relationships or building of a new relationship. And lastly, mediation is voluntary, so individuals have the choice to participate, and at any time, if it's not working for them, they get to walk away. So some of the strengths that can come from that are, ADR approaches can be a mechanism to bring those impacted by a problem together with government leaders or civic representatives or other nonprofits in order to come together and work together to find common ground and common pathways for conflict resolution. They can provide tools that will be needed to help reshape policies if and when people are ready to work together to solve significant social problems and issues that are in front of us. Some of the cornerstones of these approaches, truly do seek the inclusion and authentic participation of diverse array of groups and individuals needed to solve the problem, and those in particular who generally aren't included in those processes to begin with. So there's an aspiration for that for sure. There are mechanisms provided by ADR to create a constructive place for having challenging conversations. There's an emphasis on creating outcomes in processes and projects that bring not just meaningful but durable changes and solutions that serve the needs, hopefully serve the needs of diverse communities. But there's also limitations too, especially limitations that arise when you're working to dismantle institutional racism. And I think it's necessary to kind of understand that there are different approaches that play different roles, and it's really the combined efforts of these different approaches and roles that will end up moving the ball forward in a significant way. So it's important to acknowledge the strength, the principles and the strengths of ADR, but also kind of how it's constructed and how limitations sort of arise from that construction. So ADR's, one of the limitations is that ADR is not always capable or not primarily capable in its ability to push deeper institutional change. So things like mediation and collaborative governance assume that there's sort of a willingness to voluntarily come to the table. But when you're kind of addressing changing entrenched systems of power, those in power have to be willing to come to the table to engage in any form of authentic participation and shared decision making. It can't just be window dressing. So, if those conditions don't exist, then things like activism, changes in law, court mandates, other forms of public pressure are oftentimes better tools to force change, and those tools can oftentimes serve as a way to create the conditions where ADR methodologies can then be more effective in what they're doing. There's also a challenge that exists in the need for the field itself to evolve. So ADR has grown a lot out of the legal and labor negotiation fields at that time as an innovative approach to resolving public issues, particularly as an alternative to more traditional processes of governance. But it also reflects the bias and institutional racism of those fields. So to better address racial disparities and fully realize the promise of inclusion and representation, the field will need to evolve and challenge some of its basic assumptions. So, for example, one of the basic assumptions is sort of an emphasis really on the importance of facilitators to be neutral and unbiased in order to be effective. So this assumes some level of a balance of power in the process, but we're also, and have for a long time understood how deeply uneven the balance of power is between government and communities of color, or other kinds of institutions as well, not just government. So the field of ADR has to consider how to approach public issues that recognize the significance of that power differential. So, thinking about another approach that could provide better options, much like in the previous example around activism or changes to law. Restorative justice can sometimes be more effective in addressing issues, especially when things are characterized more in terms of someone who has been harmed and someone who's done harm. So, which oftentimes, I think rightfully so, institutional racism is framed in that way. So, where you have a party that suffered harm and a party that has done harm, then, that party should be able to empathize and acknowledge the harm in order to set the stage for correcting the damage and finding a pathway forward. Finally, ADR, particularly in the public policy arena, has evolved out of the legal system, initially in the realm of lawyers, and it's evolved to a profession of mediation and conflict resolution that's still dominated by white practitioners. So for it to really be effective, it's essential that there is a way for the institutions of ADR themselves to more effectively integrate in and represent the people who are most impacted. So, BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. So, so I at this point, I think I'll turn it over to Laurel and Damon to kind of continue on with the process.
We'll turn it back to David to see what other questions are emerging for you.
Well, Damon, you've started in this field a number of years ago, and here we are 2020 with this really hitting a fulcrum. What's your perspective for what clients are bringing or organizations are needing to do at this time?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about a program that we are working on at MPCC, David. So to Senator Roblin, Senator Frederick, Dr. Gervin, and Manuel, to everyone watching and listening, one of the many aspects of MPC's credibility as an institution is based upon its connection to various governmental agencies and institutional stakeholders throughout Oregon. However, MPCC has also recognizes that its connection to and relationship with communities of color throughout Oregon is an opportunity to strengthen. An outcome of the processes of internal strategic planning and staff immersion and learning about equity over the last several years for NPCC is that it has embarked upon an intentionality-centered developmental journey to broaden its connection to those communities in the current design of a program entitled the Partnership Program with Practitioners, Associates, and Consultants of Color. Now, it is being designed by a 7-person development team, 4 of whom are NPCC staff and 3 who are externally based consultants from the community. And this particular pilot designed to build co-learning partnerships with a cohort of facilitators, mentors, consultants, and project managers currently engaged in community development efforts that are from communities of color and other historically underrepresented communities. The pilot will aim to help identify those aforementioned institutional barriers by transforming the nature of NPCC's work processes in ways that build upon the National Policy Consensus Center core principles and aspirations for comprehensive inclusiveness and access. The pilot will also seek to begin to build a relationship-based pipeline of skilled practitioners with both lived and technical experience for future work on NPCC projects. So the curriculum design, which again is in process and is not yet complete, will include an initial pilot program of approximately 4 to 5 cohort participants that will meet weekly with NPC staff to explore the principles and frameworks of collaborative governance approaches, which will include the principles of popular education to enable co-learning. 2, work side by side with NPC staff, applying the collaborative governance and community-based concepts to cases and projects within the center. 3, be paired with mentors to include either individuals from within the NPCC staff or external NPCC partnered long-term professionals to foster one-to-one support learning. 4, be paid a monthly stipend for a minimum of 8 hours a week for 26 weeks for weekly training sessions, bi-weekly mentor meetings, and work on projects. And 5, matriculate and complete the Collaborative Governance Graduate Certificate Program or reconfigured certificate program. In addition, an objective of the program will be that cohort participants will establish relationships with stakeholders within the NPCC network, and that ideally, NPCC staff will also establish broader, authentic, and substantive relationships with communities of color and organizations around the state. The National Policy Consensus Center is committed to the notion that government, academic, private enterprise, and the nonprofit sector, as well as regular folks, can choose the value of intentionality in seeking to redress the impacts of implicit bias and institutionalism, and reconfigure in a way that is affirmative for all Oregon residents its connections with communities of color. NPCC knows that we as Oregonians exist within an entrepreneurially oriented, ingenuity-spirited state within the areas of civic engagement, citizen initiative reviews, collaborative governance, partnerships between institutions and tribal communities, and partnerships between rural and urban communities. So programs such as this one that we are developing can be a contributor alongside and in conjunction with other innovations and legislation that the senators have worked on to increase and grow healthy, equitable, empowering relationships amongst communities throughout Oregon that can, in turn, create positive, measurable impacts on the economic and social determinants of health for our state for generations to come.
Can I just underscore a little bit about what Damon's emphasizing is I think the need, we're sort of humble in our journey that as Dr. Gervin was talking about implicit bias, that all our institutions, it's one of the things that we're really recognizing how deeply embedded racism can run in our own institutions, and it's our responsibility, particularly as a public entity, to turn the lens inward and say, question of not whether, it's how does this show up and what do we need to do to make that change. And I think that's one of the efforts that we're trying to do to say, how do we transform what's embedded even in our own practices? And I think we all have to slow down and look inward and make some changes to root out where it is that these sort of institutional biases just are operating outside of our awareness. So I think that's really, when you say what can we do, I think that's one of the things we as institutions really have to commit to.
And it looks like that the data that you faculty are monitoring is what we're able to shape the future by. And what I mean by that is that there's organizations who are seeking out conflict resolutions. Laurel, you mentioned the Elliott Forest. These are state agencies. We have private companies who want to know the best practices for conflict resolution. And it's when we're left to our own faculties, we probably don't have the best makeup. But when we look towards best practices, and I put a number of links to these acronyms that our listeners have listened to today to read more about the organizations and these acronyms that we're talking about, which are right on the front lines of person-to-person engagement. And Laurel, share with us some more of these outcomes or real-time experiences that our audiences may want to reflect on that are right here in front of us.
Well, I think you're right. There's a ton of opportunities where you create the opportunity to learn from each other and teach each other where your biases are. So is your question sort of where are they? I mean, we're going to have to be doing some reinvestment of funds. You know, where should those happen? How do you begin to reinvest in community services, and what do those look like? How do you bring people together to make those investments in a way that are really going to move the dial on these disparities? And so people are recognizing that there's an opportunity to gather around and bring not just the state leaders, but the community experts, the people with lived experience, the civic leaders together to say, all right, let's work together to figure out how we're going to rejigger some of these investments to make a difference.
And with Dr. Gervin at University of Oregon, you'd mentioned some agencies that your organization had collaborated with, the state agencies who were looking at best practices to apply, whether it's training their staff or their industry. Do you see more opportunities like that also coming and asking questions, what are best practices for conflict resolution?
Definitely. I think, I mean, a lot of it is as Manuel talked about, we're in a time where a lot of attention is being brought to issues that have been going on for a long time. The renewed attention is prompting people to look. Right? There's a lot of well-meaning people who want now to recognize or I guess maybe take some ownership of the part we can all do to try to address this. So whether it's at the county levels, I mean, you mentioned this, there's a lot of folks that I know about. I've actually talked to two this week for core county folks related to criminal justice reform in our law enforcement institutions who are trying to figure out what they can do and what might best practices be. And certainly in the private sector, a lot of organizations want to understand why it is. It's sort of a realization, maybe you could think about it as if they realize, well, maybe this isn't a problem for us because all of our employees are white, to coming to a realization to say, what is it about our organization that makes it so that all of our employees are white and people who aren't white don't feel welcome here or won't stay, right? And that experience, and recognize that, I mentioned earlier, we all have these biases, but just having them, that might be a human condition, but we also have values. And so recognizing that if we're going to embrace our values, that means actually taking meaningful steps to try to address our weaknesses, right? Humans are flawed and not perfect. And so are institutions. And so there are a lot of folks who are looking, I think particularly right now, for what can we do? And I think there's a lot of people who have been looking that are tired of the ongoing, just more conversation. They are looking for those particular things that can do. What are, as you put it, best practices? What can we change about our systems of dialogue, the ways in which we can get diverse viewpoints, but not just have them here, actually have that inclusion. And ADR practices, like the National Policy Consensus Center folks were talking about, I think are extremely valuable tools for helping people recognize how to have those conversations in a way so that it's not the same voices.
And Damon, what would you recommend to someone that wants to maybe start a college path to learn more about this, to be around the table for these conflict resolutions. How was your path to where you are today? And what would you recommend to young people to really embrace this on a faculty or educational level?
I would encourage folks to seek out any opportunity, learning opportunity, whether it's free or online, where there is dialogue. And I would actually particularly encourage folks to seek to dialogue with folks that are quite the opposite of who they are in terms of ideology. That helps a great amount in terms of really opening up opportunities for folks to be able to kind of enter into the sphere where a lot of folks are learning. So I would begin there. I mean, there's a lot of free resources out here as well.
Well,
David,
yeah.
I wanted to say, and if Lou's still there, I would love to have Lou come on, because Lou has been working diligently to try to get more diversity in our teaching faculty at public schools. We have been working on that consistently, and one of the things that we hear, and I think as I've listened to you, I think we have people who can offer us help at our public schools at the University of Oregon and at Portland State. We find that we encourage these kids to go into education to become teachers, and then they don't feel comfortable in the organization that they end up in, and they don't fit there, so they decide to leave. And so we encourage people to get in there, and we haven't changed the makeup of the place that they're going to work so that they feel like they're a part of that solution. Lou, do you want to say anything?
Well, you're right, and especially as you're dealing with particular people and how the community or how the office or the school or the department might deal with things, but you have some basic issues there as well, where people simply can't get their hair cut, or get braids put in or something like that. I mean, those are the kinds of things that also happen as well, and you have the kind of not so subtle situations that take place where you know that if you go into a Safeway in a particular area, you're going to be followed through the grocery store or other places. So you have a real question in terms of being welcomed within a community and accepted within a community at times. So a lot of those things take place, and we have been trying. When I was a reporter, I did a story in 1977 about the fact that we were trying to get more African American, and that particular time, more African American teachers that, to come to be in the schools in Portland, especially in Portland, but also around the state. And we've been talking about that and trying to build that since way before that time, but it's not been something that's been effective for a number of reasons. And part of it is not feeling as though people are accepted or invited into a situation. They often feel very much the only Black person in a room is a constant thing. I know I have that take place. I'm sure that Damon has it as well, where you walk in and that's the kind of thing that you have to deal with. So it's a struggle to get folks here and to keep them here. Absolutely.
What I want to say is that it's really great to have that intellectual capacity at our universities to help solve some of these problems, because you are available. I mean, schools can reach out, communities can reach out, police agencies can reach out, and you are there to help them, to put together a program, to figure out what it is. The Hatfield does a whole lot of things at Portland State, and I just want to make sure that we clearly articulate that part of this program is to make sure that Oregonians understand that their public institutions are out there trying to be a solution as well as a place to train the people in the future. They want to be in the communities helping them solve some of these problems. And I guess I will end with that. Lou, anything to say about, because I know you work with Portland State a lot.
Well, I work with Portland State, and officially, if you ask Cy Adler, don't ask Cy Adler, but officially I am still a PhD candidate at Portland State. So, but he's my advisor, so please don't ask him. Just you can mention that you saw me, and he'll probably grumble and say, well, he says he's a student still. Okay, well, anyway, the fact is that PSU has attempted to do this, and we need to make it clear that Portland State and the other higher ed institutions in Oregon provide a value added because they are looking at these issues directly. That because that's what we're going to be dealing with in the future. And we need to have people ready to not only work with folks, but understand what has taken place in the past that creates some problems. So I applaud the kind of work that you're doing. It really is helpful, not only for the Black community, or it's helpful for the whole community, because that's who you're going to be dealing with. People are going to be dealing with each other. They're not going to be in isolated areas anymore. And that's a struggle, because folks have been so isolated that they didn't feel as though they needed to talk with other folks. They need to do that, and they need to do it well.
Well, I think that's a really, thank you for that. And I think it's one of the things I'm glad you're ending on that, because when a community can work through a conflict together, they create more resiliency, and they're a healthier fabric where they can call on each other for the next big thing that's going to be a challenge. So it starts to build a community and knit it back together at some fundamental levels. So yeah, thank you for that.
Well, go ahead, Arnie.
I just going to say thank you to all of you tonight. I hope that the people listening have some ideas, some thoughts. They now know some people they could reach out to if they have some questions, and if they want to invite them into their organization to help. So please continue to look at these people, understand that to work with us. And I'll turn it back to David.
Well, and as we look at this composition of dialogue, this is the spirit of the Fireside Chat and Rosie Shacken's vision to bring this discussion at such a crucial time that so few audiences are brought to this discussion. Our Facebook Live audiences have complemented this discussion. They're engaged, they're on point, and I just want to thank each and every one of you for being around this table. And we want to hear back, because you guys are on the front lines of looking at the numbers, the outcomes. And I hope we have great stories to report back in 3 months and 6 months of new movements in the needle. Wouldn't you all agree?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our program director here at the radio station, Larry Bloomfield, to get a little bit of background about our radio station, and then I'll wrap this up. Larry?
Hi, and thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have this beautiful radio program on, and to be able to have all of you join us and participate. And I thank you all so much for being able to do that. We're an extremely small radio station in a very small town on the coast of Oregon. And for us to be able to do this is a very special event for us. And we're very proud here at this little station. For a very small station, we are extraordinarily multiculturally diverse, whether it be young or old, Black or white, man or woman. If you wanted to get involved in a organization that can really get you emerged into that kind of thing, your public radio station here at KXCR is definitely it. Whether your dollars are donating to making that better, or your participation is involvement, we need you, and we'd love to have you.
All right, you bet. Thank you, Larry. We will see you next week at 5 p.m. for our Fireside Chat. I'm Dave Dowley, your host, and have an excellent week.
Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.